Well, hello, and welcome to the National Endowment for the Arts' second webinar in our Learning from Abroad series on international design initiatives and partnerships. Today we'll be hearing from the three designers about the role that design can play in bringing about innovation in government practice and policy. I'd like to thank Camilla Buchanan, Policy Advisor at the Design Council in the UK, for helping us to organize this conversation. And I'll turn the microphone over to her in just a second. Before we hear from her, there's a few housekeeping notes. You are all muted and will only be able to hear us. We'll give about a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation followed by a Q&A session. You can submit questions, comments at any time using the Q&A box below the PowerPoint. We will do our best to address as many of those as possible during the time we have. Please do not use the raise hand button. This webinar will be posted in the webinar section of our website in a few days so you can refer to it in the future. I'll hand things now over to our fabulous partner at the Design Council, Camilla Buchanan.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jason. So, as Jason said, my name's Camilla and I am a policy advisor at an organisation in the UK called the Design Council. And we're really grateful to the NEA for asking us to put on a panel on what is certainly one of the less visible but increasingly important areas for design, how it's being used by governments. And I think as many people listening will recognise quite readily, there has been a fundamental shift in design practice. So the design process itself is now being deemed relevant to strategic and organisational challenges, not just the creation of tangible outputs like products or web interfaces, communications material. And what we're seeing is that in governments around the world, design methods are being used in the development of frontline services and increasingly around issues such as ways of working, working cultures, and the development of public policy, which is a fairly new area of work in the UK. So we have this growing community of research and practice, and although work in the UK in using design in government's been taking place for the last decade or more, getting new methods into government is a long process, and we still have big gaps in knowledge and practice. In areas such as evidence of impact, what are the best measures for this work, and what are the best ways to embed the new ways of working that design offers? So forums like this one, created by the NEA for understanding how work is taking place in different contexts, are really, really important. I'll start off this session by giving an overview of the Design Council's work in the public sector, and then I want to make reference to some of the wider work that's going on in the UK and the EU at the European level. And then finally, I'll finish off by raising some areas for further work, really some questions based on what we're seeing from our delivery, the delivery work that we do at the Design Council. So, to briefly orientate you, the Design Council was established in 1944 by the UK Department for Business, and we were really there to promote British industrial design as an important sector to the economy. So our roots are in industry, and today we still receive a core grant from the Department for Business, but we're an enterprising charity, so we also generate income from services and private funding, partnerships and other sources. And our mission statement that you see here on the slide is championing great design to improve lives. That means taking design as an approach or as a process to a wider set of problems in business and society. So in our work here at the Design Council, we're very often working in places and with people who are hitherto unfamiliar with design, and that does still include much of the public sector in this country. So I want to give you a brief snapshot of what we do here at the Design Council in the UK. We work with businesses from manufacturers, tech startups, developers. We work with government, both central and local. And of course, we work with the design sector, both the research and the practice communities. We have three main areas of delivery. So our challenges work, our design challenges work, are large-scale open innovation competitions in extremely fraught social context. So we've worked in the reduction of hospital infections, for example, and the chair that you see on the slide there was one of the products that was developed through that challenge. We've also worked in areas such as reducing violence in accident and emergency, which I think for you guys is the ER room. And I know I've seen quite a lot on design and violence coming out of the US, certainly the discussion around that at the moment. Other issues that we've picked up: dementia care, youth employment. A second major area of work at the Design Council is our design leadership programs. And these are coaching programs in design methods. And really what we're trying to do through that work is embed design in organizations and enable people to use these approaches themselves. So we have three main client groups. Those are businesses, typically small businesses that are needing to grow, the public sector, both central and local government, and science and high-tech ventures around the commercialization of research. And then finally, through our CABE team at the Design Council, we provide advisory services in the built environment to typically developers and local government. Now, whilst we have diffuse audiences and client groups, it's really this concept of design as a process for creating change and tackling problems that unites all of the work that we do at the Design Council. And this understanding of design is underpinned by core principles and methods which go right across everything that we do. So our key principles are people first, always designing from the perspectives of people who are intended to benefit from the solution that we are creating. A second key principle for us is prototyping, iterative working, testing out solutions early and at low cost before a final idea or solution is put into practice. And then finally, clear visual communication. And to achieve this in projects, we use a number of tools and methods that we've developed over time. And many of these are rooted in ethnography and others from product design. And I won't go into the detail of those at the moment, but many of you listening in may well be familiar with the double diamond, which is the way in which we describe our design process. And so that starts with divergent generative thinking, moves through to problem definition, actually identifying the need behind a situation that we're working in, and then finally through to specification, the refining and selecting of ideas through which to design solutions around. So historically, the Design Council has been about business growth, but I want to talk about examples of our work in the public sector where we began to work about 5 or 6 years ago. Really what we were doing was applying the design coaching work that we developed with businesses, typically to local authorities. So most of the examples that I'll be using are from our design leadership programs. That's the coaching services that we run. And until recently, the vast majority of the work that we were doing with government in the UK was in local government, and typically looking at frontline services. So we've run about 30 projects to date on service challenges such as looking at frontline healthcare services, homelessness services. And the Design Council's work in this area is part of a whole ecology of charities, private companies, internal innovation teams in the UK, which are working to bring design into local government. The image that you see here on the slide is a very typical example of the type of work that we would do with local government. And we were asked by an organisation called Lewisham Borough Council, which is a local government body in South London, to help them redesign the experience of a homelessness service. And it was one of the very early projects that we did about 4 or 5 years ago with local government. And the staff were working in an acutely stressful environment with very high levels of customer dissatisfaction and staff absenteeism. And the lasting legacy from this project was a redesign of the communications environment, but also a much wider culture change, which has since become mainstream in the organisation. There's now a transformation team based at Lewisham, which are part of the local government, who are working to spread these methods throughout the work that they do at the council. And I think this slide is a really good representation of the type of translation that someone's understanding of design is going through, having had experience of it in a service context. So this is a quote from someone that we worked with in Lewisham, and she's saying that she thought of design as buildings and dresses. So this kind of private sector concept of luxury and something that's very tangible and product focused, and actually through working with design in a more strategic and user-focused context, she shifted her understanding to seeing how the process itself could be relevant to something like a public service. And Lewisham's an interesting example because their chief executive, who's a fairly vocal figure for design in government, someone called Barry Quirk, was awarded a medal last year in 2013 for bringing design methods into the public sector by an organisation called the Royal Society of the Arts in the UK. So you have this situation where design is no longer a completely unfamiliar approach across local government, but nor is it part of the DNA, and sometimes the projects that have taken place are described as being overly discreet or too London-centric. So in response to that, at the Design Council, we're currently running a workshop programme, again, for local government bodies, but specifically outside of London, and it's funded by an organisation which is one of our major academic research funders in the UK, called the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And it's the first time here at the Design Council that we've done something which is structured, that falls in between training and a workshop program. So the idea is that it's catalytic. So over a 3-month period, we are working with 3 different groups of about 16 people from different local government bodies who can't normally access design. And the aim is to put them in a position where they've used design, where they understand who some of the providers in this space are, so the Design Council and others, and that they've shaped a design brief around their own problems so that they can commission out further work. And we're working very hard to capture insights and evidence around what working in this intermediary space between training and delivery means, and what the value of that for people inside government is. So that's work that's evolving at the moment, and we will have research insights to share from that towards the end of the year. So over the past 2 years in the UK, things have been changing in central government too, and Beatrice from the Policy Lab is going to say much more about this in a moment. But what we're seeing is a raft of initiatives from central government which are increasing not only the visibility of design, but also the licence to use it. And a major driver for that in the UK has been something called the Civil Service Reform Plan, and that's really our government's plan to modernise ways of working within government. And it was developed in 2012, and it includes directives such as bringing new methods into policy development. Another major initiative in central government in the UK is called the Government Digital Service, and that's been a web redesign project which has totally reshaped, a tech and design-led project right at the heart of central government, which has totally reshaped all of our central government websites and therefore the public's web interface with central government. And then finally an organisation called Civil Service Learning, which is working to bring new methods, including design, into policy training. And of course now we have the new Policy Lab as of the 1st of April this year, which Beatrice will be speaking from in just a moment. So the Design Council has now delivered training sessions to nearly 400 central government civil servants, and many of these are at senior levels. And work is now beginning to take place, and this is really, really important, on what is the ongoing support after training. How do we support people in their day-to-day work after perhaps they've attended a training workshop on design, and what does that curriculum look like? So we're beginning to see much more of a focus on that in the UK, which is of course a vital area. And the Design Council is also working on policy development projects, so moving up to much more structural and strategic levels in government. And specifically at the moment, we're working on a project around a change in legislation. So there are 2 elements to this project. One is the change of legislation, and the other is the communications material that wraps around that. So the websites, the forms, the ways in which that communication is filtered out to the public. And it's giving us some insights on how design can be used in more strategic contexts in government. So some of the things that we're seeing is the ability of these methods, typically in a workshop context, to create a common language for groups, with very passionate groups with very divergent views, and they're centering on design as a common way of working. Another thing that we've done in this context is a visual mapping out of a complex legislative process from end to end for the first time, and that's making it much clearer for us to identify blockages and the actual things within it, things to focus on to redesign. And it's also been very generative, and typically in a workshop shop context, we're seeing much more ideas come through for a change in legislation, and actually we're getting much richer human insights into that. And it should be said actually that the work that we're doing is not replacing any existing systems in government. It's sitting alongside a typical public consultation process, but it's augmenting that with much richer human insights. So things are also changing at the EU level, and in 2009 there was a political commitment from the European Commission to raise the bar really on design at the EU level, which resulted in a whole range of funded projects. And the Design Council is currently leading a consortium to deliver the largest of these, which has really just in the last couple of weeks kicked off, and it's called the European Design Innovation Platform, and it's a 3-year project to increase awareness of design in the public and private sectors in the EU, and it will be a web platform aggregating a whole range of case studies from the EU and beyond, toolkits, and really the first time ever that we've had both a repository but also a resource and a source of information on design at the EU level, and that's supported by an entire training program and a program of engagement. The first iteration of the website will be live imminently, and the full platform will be ready by the end of the year, and you can register interest. I've put the URL on the slide here, and it's www.designplatform.eu. So we would love to have some people from beyond the EU engaging with that. Now, I've been focusing on our delivery work, but at the Design Council we also do a huge amount of advocacy and research on how design can be of value in different contexts within government. And I just wanted to flag a couple of reports really as ways of finding out more information. So both of these we did in partnership, and they came out last year, and the first on the left here is called Design for Public Good, and that's a really helpful representation of work that's gone on in different European Union member states, and it's also useful because it pitches the projects at different levels. So something like the Government Digital Service in the UK is included in that report as an example of government itself using design from within as a way of working. And the second report I wanted to mention is called Restarting Britain 2, pulled together by a body in the UK called the Design Commission, and that really is an excellent rationale for why design is helpful in a government context and sets the landscape in the UK as it was at that time. And just to finish, I wanted to raise some areas for further discussion based on what we're seeing from our delivery work, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to pick these up in the discussion. And we're very much looking forward to hearing contributions from those listening in as well. So some of the really important issues that we're seeing is evidence. There is still a dearth of evidence on the value of design, and we really need to get better at measuring impact and communicating to those who are likely from within government to be able to procure this kind of work. Another really important issue, how does design fit with other innovation approaches? So we're seeing a lot of work on behavioural insights and well-being in the UK at the moment, and this is particularly important as we move up to more structural levels. Again, how does design work in a context where public opinion and political will are really, really important? You're never creating policy in what's often referred to as ground zero, so how do we work in a context where the content of the policy could change overnight depending on political factors? Finally, as we're getting more and more civil servants interested in design, how can they be supported to use these methods? What's the space, what's the language, what's the leadership that's required? What's the curriculum around supporting non-designers coming to design? And then finally, what training do we need for designers in government? You're very unlikely to leave a graphic design course in the UK at the moment and be able to walk straight into our central government, for example. So I've tried to give you a snapshot of work that's taking place in the UK, which broadly speaking has moved from the service level to being much more relevant to policy and cultural challenges. And for us at the Design Council, it's increasingly about taking our core design principles and methods and adapting them to the context, be it strategic or service issue, rather than focusing on design for policy or design for services. I think that's a much more helpful way of looking at it. What are the principles that we're trying to achieve? What are the principles that are common to those that we're working with in government? And we'll pick up, I hope, on some of the questions in the discussion, but I'm now going to hand over to Chelsea Malden, who is the director of the Public Policy Lab in New York, and I'm really looking forward to her talking about the service redesign work that they do, but also the impact that that has on a wider culture and policy change in the organisations that they're working with. So thanks very much, and over to you, Chelsea.
Camilla, thank you. I appreciate the wonderful lead-in, and the work that you guys are doing is so interesting and honestly pretty inspirational to us here at the Public Policy Lab. So just to give you a quick overview of who we are a public interest organization. We say that our mission is to design services to empower all Americans. We are based in Dumbo, Brooklyn, and in fact, they're building a wonderful new Brooklyn Bridge Park right outside our window, so I hope you guys can't hear the construction equipment in the background. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, a charity in UK parlance, founded in 2011, and we partner exclusively with U.S. government agencies, focusing right now on agencies in New York City and on federal government agencies. And that partnership is a really important word to us. We really do feel that government is not our client, but rather our partner, and that what we are doing is working with government agencies to try to improve public services for our true clients who are members of the public. So just to, and I should say a little bit more about the partnership model that we use before I go on. In order to make explicit the fact that it is a partnership, we ask a couple of things of our agency partners. First, we ask that they give us a high level of kind of buy-in or authorization from senior decision-making staff at the agency, because we're often going to be recommending change processes, and we really need that level of executive authorization before we can do our work. Next, we ask that they embed staff in our teams. We won't function as consultants where they say, oh, we have this problem, and then we go off and design to solve it, and we come back and give them some deliverable. We say you have to actually have members of the staff commit to coming and being with teams who are made up of designers and social scientists and work with us to generate solutions. That's for a bunch of reasons, so that we can benefit from the expertise of the people who are working inside of agencies. It's also so they see how designers and social scientists work and act and how we go about solving these kinds of public sector challenges using a design approach, because we really feel like we're trying to build capacity within agencies to think about using design approaches. And then finally, we create a lot of trouble for ourselves by requiring that our agency partners allow us to publish on the projects that we do. We won't work under non-disclosure agreements. We won't sign away the intellectual property rights to the work that we create, not because we want to profit on it, but because we really want to be able to share the work that we're doing with public agencies so that we can help spread this approach across government at all levels in the United States. And I'll be giving some references to some of our publications on our project work as we get farther into the presentation. So moving on. So I said that government is our partner, not our client. So who do we think our clients are? We think our clients are actually the members of the public who we are attempting to serve and empower through providing better public services. So to give you an example of what that looks like for us, last year, for example, we say that our clients were 45,000 high-need children for whom we worked with the New York City Department of Education on a particularly complicated bit of service delivery. Also for 75,000 plus 8th grade students and their families. Again, a project with the New York City Department of Education looking at the process by which students choose which high schools to apply to, with obvious impacts on their subsequent life success and college readiness. And then also more than 200,000 low and middle income New Yorkers who are applicants for affordable housing in New York City, just to give you a sense of the kind of scope and range of the work that we do. So how exactly do we do this work? And I should say here that we use a methodology which is, some people call it broadly termed service design. And the idea here is that you can design how people experience the delivery of a service just like you could design a building or address, to use Camilla's example from earlier, that you can make decisions when you create a service that will affect how people are able to use that service and the experience that they have when using it. And I should probably say that service design has a couple of key characteristics, and there are 5 characteristics actually that we think are particularly important. First, that service design is an approach which is user-centered, meaning that you start from the point of view of the user of the service, whereas many public services often get designed from the point of view of the agency who is commissioning them. That it is co-creative, meaning it's not enough for us that we ask what does the public want and desire and experience when using a public service, but additionally, we think that it's necessary to actually design an improved service with the public and with service providers. We as designers shouldn't make all of the decisions. In fact, we should just be the professional hand who kind of acts on the will of the people who are going to use and provide the service. Service design is visual and iterative, meaning we create visual representations of our work as we make it so that everyone can sort of see and touch and engage with the same set of ideas simultaneously. And iterative, as Camilla described earlier, meaning that we do multiple rounds where we make a thing, we try to figure out how it's working and how it's not working, and then we make it again. And by creating really low-fi representations of the services we're attempting to create and messing around with them long before they ever get deployed publicly, we hope that we can end up creating things which are more functional for the public. Whereas, as many of you may know, a lot of times public services are just invented and then deployed to the public without really any kind of a testing process behind the scenes. Service design is time-based, meaning that we look at an entire user journey. We look at all of the ways, all the steps that somebody has to go through in order to access and use a public service. And because our work is time-based, it also ends up being holistic, meaning that we end up looking at all of the different kind of staff and back-end solutions and policy decisions that create the context in which the service is delivered. So what that means in terms of how we actually work is not too different from what Camilla showed in her double diamond. For us, we break it into what we call our three main phases: discovery, design, and piloting and evaluation. The task of the first phase is really to ask the question, what are users experiencing? What are their preferences? And then what are their needs should this service be improved? Second is that design phase that I described briefly before, where we attempt to do co-design with the users and providers and come up with rapid prototypes of potential service solutions. And again, those prototypes may be prototypes of tangible artifacts, a new website, a new print hard copy material, but just as commonly, and in fact, I would say more importantly, those prototypes are prototypes of new forms of interaction between the public agency and their users and providers, new ways of acting so that people have different and improved outcomes. And then at the end of our design phase, we typically plan pilots. We make a series of recommendations to our public agency partners about how they can actually implement this new way of engaging with the public and how they can implement any particular tools and materials that we've designed for them. And then our final phase really gets at what Camilla was mentioning about the dearth of evaluation. We think it's absolutely crucial that these projects not just kind of go out into the world, but rather they be tested in small-scale populations, and that we attempt to see how well did our designs work. First, in terms of specifics of implementation, to what degree was the agency actually able to implement what we hoped they were able to implement? And then also to what degree did that implementation meet our original design objectives? We think it's very important to look both at the process and the outcomes piece. It's not useful to do one without doing the other. So I have two quick case studies here for you. The first is of a project that we have been doing now with the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And the key question that we're attempting to answer there is how can we help more eligible people apply for affordable housing? Meaning not just more people, but also the people who apply are more likely to be eligible for the housing that they're applying for. And everything I'm going to be talking about today pretty much is documented in this book that you see right here. It's called Public and Collaborative Designing Services for Housing. and it is a report on our discovery and our design phase for this project. I just want to mention that in addition to our partnership with the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, we were also working on this project with the research lab at Parsons, the new school for design, called the Parsons Justice Lab, and we were generously supported by the Rockefeller Foundation in creating this work. So what does HPD do? HPD is one of New York City's 2 affordable housing agencies. They're the agency that works with not-for-profit and private sector housing developers to create more affordable units in the market, typically aimed at both low and middle income residents of the city. And when we came out of our discovery phase, it seemed as if there was a particular area which was most useful for us to focus on with the agency, and that was on what they call the lottery and lease-up process. I should say that the United States is unusual in most countries in how we distribute affordable housing resources, and that rather than doing upfront an assessment of residents' need, what we typically do in New York City and common across the U.S. is we hold a lottery where people can sort of put their names in a hat to be selected to see if they have the opportunity to then be screened for eligibility for affordable housing. So the questions that the agency were bringing to us was, how do we make that process of applying for this quote-unquote lottery and then going through the process of being screened should you receive a kind of high lottery number, how do we make that clearer and more satisfying for users, while simultaneously also making it clear to people what they will need to in fact prove about their income, their household size, et cetera, should they be selected. So in order to develop proposals that would be most helpful, we did iterative research and design with the agency itself, with community-based organizations that focus on housing or other forms of community development across New York City, with housing developers, both for-profit and not-for-profit developers, and also with residents, either folks who were eligible and interested in applying for affordable housing or people who had actually gone through the application process previously. And you see here some pictures of members of our team. We had 4 design fellows on this project meeting with housing developers and with community members in various places around New York. What comes out of that work is a kind of synthesis of user needs or a diagnosis of user needs. Here are 2 that we discovered during the course of this project. This question of people having a difficult time documenting their income so that they could prove their eligibility. Also just a lack of clarity on how the affordable housing process works. 2 additional ones that you can find in that book that I described to you and on page 43, that's what that little blue bubble means. We're reaching unnetworked New Yorkers, folks who didn't have access to information delivery systems that were the primary ways of sharing affordable housing information. And then also there's a kind of challenge around attracting a range of different kinds of applicants. To respond to that diagnosis of user needs, we ended up making 4 proposals to the agency of different approaches based in user-centered design methodologies that we thought that they could pilot that might potentially generate benefit. So the first of those was really that they adopt and use a suite of new informational materials. And you can see that there were 5 different materials which our team designed for the agency, ranging from a kind of quick start guide to understand what affordable housing is and how the process works, to specific tools to make it clear what the details and requirements were for applying to a particular affordable housing development, a kind of overall listing of all of the available developments across the city in a given month, and then some specific tools to help people understand how to correctly apply and correctly document their income. What we also said to the agency, however, was that we felt that those materials were only as useful as their delivery system, and that their delivery system honestly couldn't and shouldn't just be, okay, we have these PDFs and we're going to post them on our website. Not that that's not helpful, it is helpful, but that what we heard when we talked to users and to people who are active in the field was that in many cases people needed assistance, they needed more hands-on person-to-person assistance, kind of walking their way through the process. Some of that also relates to digital divide issues. It relates to low literacy issues, particularly on low-income populations. but that really that kind of human-to-human impact was crucially important. So we developed 3 different strategies for the agency to use to better engage with the public on different scales. And I'd recommend that you look at the documents to kind of read more about those. So we are right now in stage 3 of this project, and we are doing evaluation. We've released our preliminary evaluation plan. That is also available on our website at www.publicpolicylab.org. We're working right now on subsequent evaluations, looking at evaluation of process and also evaluation of outcome. And those plans should be available sometime, I would say, in the late summer or early fall. And hopefully we'll have some interesting findings to share with everybody. So a quick second case study I want to run through before I hand off to Beatrice. And that's really some work that we've been doing with the New York City Department of Education around thinking about the choice process. In the U.S. in particular, there's a strong interest in using kind of market-based approaches to better deliver public services, including thinking of citizens as consumers and therefore providing them with options to choose how they take delivery of a public service. I think that what we have found, and this is supported by our work with some behavioral economists, is that choices are good as long as people are in a position to make informed and meaningful choices, that just making a choice isn't necessarily valuable. So our question here with the New York City Department of Education was, what do families need to make informed, meaningful choices when they are attempting to figure out which high school a child or student is going to apply to? And all of this information is, again, documented in a report that everybody can download as a PDF from our website called Understanding the School Choice Experience. So quick overview here. The New York City Department of Education educates 0.1 million students, the largest public school system in the world, I believe. And that means that 1 in 300 Americans, every 1 of 300 Americans is a New York City public school student. Every year, about 75 to 80,000 eighth graders transition from middle school into high school, and they don't just go to their local community school. Rather, they must apply to over 700 different, to up to 12 of 700 different high school programs for a seat. And that process, as you might imagine, is a complicated one. And the question was, how do we help people make the best choices about which schools to apply to? To understand that, we did ethnographic research with policymakers, with school staff, with parents, and with children. We went all over New York City, as you can see from these little dots, meeting with different kinds of people. We met in offices, we met with students in groups at schools. We actually went and hung out with parents and children in their homes so we can kind of observe how parents and students talked about this when they were together. And we ended up realizing that there were really 3 crucial players in this process of school choice: the family, the child, and the guidance counselor, and that each one of them had different kinds of roles to play in the process. And that they were doing that within a variety of very different choice contexts, but that they ended up having 4 common needs from the system. In order to, and this was true both of families and of guidance counselors and of students. So in order to respond to those needs, we made a series of recommendations to the agency for ideas to approach through design. So that's what this one here, you see marked a little plus. Participants want sorting tools so they can judge if schools match their preferences. And we tried to suggest to the agency that there were different mechanisms through which they might be able to meet that need, whether it's a OkCupid style matchmaking website for schools to a kind of print-on-demand, hard copy mini directory by school theme. That a single design prompt could lead to many different kinds of design outcomes. One of the design outcomes it did lead to was that the district was able to run an app challenge to develop a series of mobile applications to help people better sort through high school data. And that work was directly informed by the discovery research that we had done with the agency. You can actually find out much more about this project through a little short film that we made. It's up on our website. It's also available on our YouTube channel, where you can see some of the parents who we spoke with and hear them talk about their experiences talking to our researchers and also designing the apps. The apps themselves were designed through a co-design process. We're hopeful that this project will lead into an additional round of design, which will be about creating more non-appy solutions for families as well, but that's to be determined. So that's me for now, and I'm happy to talk subsequently about more of the work that we're doing currently and in the future. But for right now, I think I should hand off to Beatrice so that she can share more on her work. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thanks for the opportunity to speak in this webinar. I'm Beatrice Andrews. I'm from the Cabinet Office, and I have been responsible over the last few months for setting up a policy lab, which is funded by most of the government departments in the UK and will run as a pilot for a year. That lab is now being headed by Dr. Andrea Seidmock, who's got a background in design and has previously in fact worked at the Design Council, and is seated within the Cabinet Office, which is central government department which supports the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and essentially ensures the effective running of government. Cabinet Office has a number of is the corporate centre of government and has a number of areas of policy responsibility, including most relevant to this agenda, civil service reform and the government innovation agenda. So I just want to take the time today to talk to you a little bit about the Policy Lab, how it came about. We launched on the 1st of April, so this is a very early kind of prototype, if you like, of our approach. And we really want to sort of prove our worth by doing rather than just telling you about all the great things we're going to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're aiming to do and then what we're working on now, and you can sort of judge for yourselves whether you think that's a good idea. So a little bit just about the backstory to the Policy Lab. Camilla's already referred to the civil service reform plan. That's really a sort of flagship policy of this government, but I think there's cross-party recognition of the need for that change, and then the kind of recognition that the service had become large, unwieldy, detached from the public in some ways, and with some sort of limited expertise in some in, for example, commercial skills, financial skills and procurement, but also, I guess, in some ways more concerningly, its kind of bread and butter policy advice was increasingly found wanting by ministers who felt two main things. Firstly, that the inputs into that policy making process were narrow. There was a sort of Whitehall knows best approach with limited engagement with the outside world on policy making in the early stages of the policy making process. And then on implementation, that policy just wasn't being designed with implementation in mind, and a function of it being distant from those users. So there'd been a fairly long-term debate about how to make policy better and to professionalise it, and reasonably influential think tanks in the UK, such as the Institute for Government, had now made a number of recommendations in that regard. But there's also obviously, as Camilla's referred to, an increasing interest in what design can do across government. Civil servants having been involved in some of that, in that design leadership programme, the Design Council sort of service design stories kind of being told across government, and also that move towards strategic design. Government digital service, again, Camilla's mentioned, had sort of blazed a trail in terms of a radical shake-up of all the government websites and bringing user-led design sort of direct into the heart of government and the digital services that government provides. Similarly, it's worth mentioning the behavioural insights team, which also until very recently sat within the Cabinet Office, and that had introduced sort of new ways of working to departments around the sort of behavioural insights approach that is in some ways a sort of model for the kind of policy lab, the way in which we seek to work with government. So the Civil Service Reform Plan was launched in 2011 with open policy making as a game changer action, so one of 6 kind of core actions in that reform plan. And the plan itself recognises the role of policy labs globally in bringing new perspectives to the policy making process. The Policy Lab now established. It's funded by most government departments. We've got a small budget, but a fairly large ambition, and 1 year to prove the concept. And we already know, I think, from international colleagues that that's a pretty tall order. This slide just sort of starts to demonstrate its fit within that kind of wider push to professionalise policy, to improve standards generally, including how to brief ministers, prepare responses to parliamentary questions and all the kind of standard things that are expected of civil servants, but also sort of kind of beneath that, but broadening that out, this open policy making agenda, a recognition that civil servants don't always have the answers, we don't always know what will work, and we take too long to find new ideas and solutions and put them into practice. And I speak as a civil servant who's sort of been through this process myself, so I've kind of experienced it and now hopefully seen the light in terms of the way that I operate. So open policy making is about opening up the process to new ways of thinking and doing policy. It's about a mindset. It's about drawing from the best possible range of evidence. It's about being informed by a range of views and looking for the latest kind of cutting edge thinking. It's about considering problems from the user perspective, and it's about testing and iterating solutions in the real world. And the policy lab itself is essentially a kind of practical demonstration of what open policy making looks like. The lab, as I say, launched at the beginning of April. We've got just over sort of 500 followers of Twitter on Twitter within the first month, and I think demonstrating the kind of interest and anticipation there is around this, and the sort of developments happening in government in this agenda. This is our sort of draft vision for the lab at the moment, about being a creative space where policy teams can draw on techniques such as design-based thinking and ethnography to approach policy problems in new ways. And that kind of learning as we go and sharing that learning is really at the sort of core of what we want to do within the policy lab. The idea of creating this space to help people think and behave differently, to develop new skills and new understanding across government is really important. And at the moment, that is certainly a conceptual rather than an actual space. But I think still important, that sort of idea of freeing policymakers from the kind of shackles of the current expectations within the departments, from the normal processes of kind of policy wheels and policy cycles, from always kind of talking to the usual suspects and kind of thinking in the same ways. So what we are seeking to do is help those key decision makers, those policy makers in government and public services, to view their efforts from the outside in, to gain a different perspective on the policy, and understand what actually matters to people. So we were told a story the other day from someone about how in reporting noise pollution, there were different processes that they had to go through depending on whether the noise came from their neighbours or from somewhere out in the street. If the noise was coming from, say, a very loud car passing the street, they had to tell the police. If it was their neighbours, they had to tell the local authority. And obviously from a kind of public perspective, that's confusing and frustrating. So we want in the lab to really kind of actually work with key decision makers, and I thought what Chelsea was saying about kind of getting those policy makers involved and making them kind of do some of the work is absolutely about what we want to do kind of within the policy lab. I think there has been some sort of bruising in central government over time from some other cross-government ventures which have felt very much like departments have had people kind of parachuted in to tell them how to do stuff, and have then kind of been left to sort of, who haven't then stuck around for the kind of messy business of implementation. So we're really keen to get those civil servants out and about, and help them gain the practical skills and confidence to use new and experimental approaches. For example, in our first project, which I'll come on to talk about briefly shortly, giving civil servants the opportunity to go out, and I've done this too, to with the ethnographers to interview and observe police officers and victims of crime in Surrey, to understand how the current reporting process is working for all involved. So, and this is one piece of feedback that we've had quite consistently from civil servants, that they don't always feel that they've got the experience or the license to work in this way, and in particular around digital skills, but also about talking to the public and people in frontline jobs. And the challenge, I think, for us in the policy lab is to encourage civil servants to do that, to test and try new things, but also to kind of maintain those standards and ensure that the sort of understanding of the issues doesn't get diluted. So I'm conscious of the time and keeping time for discussion. I might flick through a couple of these slides, just a little bit more about the sort of collaboration, the types of people that we expect to kind of be involving in each of the lab projects. These are the sorts of methods that we expect that we will kind of get the opportunity to test over the year. And you may kind of recognise some of those. Briefly on ethnography, our first current project with the Home Office, ethnography is kind of a core part of that. We've learned a lot already from Mind Lab, and they were in fact involved in sort of the beginning of that project, and the sort of ethnographic research, the observation and following users is kind of a core part of what they do, and certainly something I think we see as a core part of what we'll offer as Policy Lab. And kind of as an extension of that, the user journey mapping, and this user journey is from that crime project. Data visualization, big data, data science, something that's really interesting in UK government, really interested in at the moment, and lots of work going on around there, how government kind of uses and exploits this kind of huge mass of big, messy, fast-moving data and unstructured data that it has access to, and I think is much better exploited currently in the private sector than in government in the UK. Also, prototyping, I think, worth a mention, because it's not something that's kind of done very consistently, I don't think, in the government at the moment. These are some images of a pharmacy in Cornwall where they were sort of prototyping pharmacists giving out, directing over 50s who are unemployed in Cornwall, which is a sort of a fairly isolated, parts of Cornwall, very isolated rural areas, giving advice to those people, because that was the sort of one kind of area of contact with authority that they had. So what will the lab offer look like to departments? Over the next year, we want to do about 3 lab projects, which will be sort of 3 to 5 large projects, which will be a test ground for new thinking, and demonstration projects like the Home Office one that build evidence and tools for policy making. And secondly, a sort of lab-like, which is more an offer to kind of a wider set of departments, so a short but intensive immersion into lab thinking and practice, perhaps hosted at a summer camp, which will bring together some world-class experts around policy questions for departments. I'm sorry, I'm rattling through this last bit, but I am conscious of the time. Very briefly, this is our current project with the Home Office, which is about reimagining policing. It was chosen, I think, primarily because of the kind of enthusiasm and interest in the department, and the fact that we had a sort of test bed in 2 police forces in the south of the UK who were happy to kind of try out some new ways of working. So I think in identifying that first project, it was very much a pragmatic decision rather than a scientific choice. And already, I suppose, we've pushed that project back from how do we get more people to report crime online, which was really the kind of police force's overriding mission, to how do we learn from the current reporting experience to improve it, and at the same time explore the opportunities that digital reporting might create, including what the police are quite interested in, which is how they use digital tools for more effective collaboration between the police and the public on investigations. And that project runs until around July. Ethnography, a key part of that, understanding the victim kind of journeys, and we are planning a sort of large collaborative workshop with victims, with police, with representatives of neighbourhood watch organisations, etc., in the south of England in the summer. In conclusion, just to go back to that sort of that 3-tier model, if you think of it, the lab being at the bottom, sort of trying the innovative projects, trying some new solutions, building the capability within the civil service, so there is sort of improved performance and new skills, knowledge and tools across departments. But more ambitiously, I think the lab is part of that wider kind of drive for systemic and cultural change across the civil service within the UK, inspiring new ways of thinking across government and hopefully outside too. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both Beatrice and Chelsea. It's Camilla again here. Two really interesting examples of how design is being used in government and its move up to more strategic levels. So I would almost argue that the Public Policy Lab in New York is working by stealth on wider culture and policy change, and we've got a really interesting moment in the UK with the Policy Lab right in the heart of our most strategic and political government department, a new design team. So we're only at the beginning of really understanding what that means for policy development in the UK. We haven't got much time, so I'm going to move straight into audience questions. And I can see the list of attendees, so I know there's some people tuning in who know a lot about this work. So do keep feeding your questions in. But just to begin, we have one from Kim Elliott, which has a fair few different elements to it. So I'm going to kick off with one of them. So you're asking about the specificity of the design projects we're talking about. Are we talking about graphic design? Are we talking about architecture? My response to that is what we are seeing is design evolving. The sector is evolving, and the way in which we use this is evolving. So it's, in our work, been a real shift away from the development of smart products, even smart services or communications material, to actually this focus on the design process. And the work that we do, as I mentioned earlier, is often borrowing approaches that have been developed in product design and often ethnography, often areas which aren't necessarily design at all, but have evolved to become something new. And actually, some of the best thinking about this is taking place in the US. So you have the transdisciplinary design work at Parsons New School, you have Change Labs based down in Stanford University. Some of the most high-level thinking that I've seen in government is the work by the UN Institute for Research and Disarmament. So that's Derek Miller and Lisa Rudnick, and these are policymakers who are adapting design methods as part of their way of working. So no, we're not talking in this context, to my mind, about a specific design item, a specific design output. It's much more an approach or a process which can often augment other ways of working in government, and which may result in some cases in a redesigned form, but actually it's really the way of thinking that has enabled us to arrive at that solution that is important. So that's one bit of your question, Kim. The other bit was about impact, and I wanted to direct that one towards Chelsea, given it's so at the heart of the work that the Public Policy Lab is doing. And Chelsea, just if you could give us a synopsis. I know you're working in partnership, but of the type of evidence and the types of argument, perhaps the types of language that you have found gain traction when you're trying to express this this kind of work, perhaps to cynics. So over to you, Chelsea. It's really on the question of gathering evidence and then how to communicate it.
Sure. I mean, I would say that one kind of interesting and unexpected issue around impact is that we, the design team, are often much more committed to measuring impact than our public partners are. This is not the case with the people who we are working with right now, I should say, but I should say that in past projects that we have done in my past life before the Public Policy Lab, that government agencies often have it's frightening to do impact evaluation, because you might show, in fact, that something that the public dollar has just been spent on didn't have the same impact that people wanted it to have. So when you ask a public agency to do a careful impact evaluation, you actually are doing that in a context where there's a lot of risk associated with evaluating impact. That said, the partners who we're working with now are amazing and are so happy to participate in that, and we're really looking at this question, as I mentioned earlier, of first, to what degree are the design concepts and the design deliverables that we create together, are they actually usable? Like, are we actually doing a good job providing stuff that's usable? And then to what degree are we meeting the objectives that we tend to set out and meet? And I can't tell you yet I can't give you a clear answer as to what the answer is on that, because we're still in the midst of evaluation, but we should have some more feedback for everybody later in the year.
That's great. Thanks, Chelsea. I think we're only going to have time for one more question, I'm afraid, and it's one that I want to direct towards Beatrice. So from Andrew Taylor, you're asking us about design clients, and who the best of those are probably people that are eager to engage. So Beatrice, if you can in 1 minute give us a sense of how the work that you're doing is being received by people in central government. That would be a really helpful insight.
Great, thanks, Camilla. Yeah, really well. I think people are really eager to engage, and we've certainly been very encouraged by the number of projects and kind of proposals that people are coming to us with. I think it's really sort of about the confidence to do that, to have that, the confidence that they will have the support kind of at a senior level in government, and certainly around the sort of Policy Lab and the open policy making agenda more broadly. We're sort of making sure that we're aiming at the kind of most senior levels of government, and certainly we've got the backing of Sir Jeremy Hayward, who is the Cabinet Secretary in the UK, so the most sort of senior civil servant effectively, and very much kind of pushing this agenda, and that's very helpful in terms of kind of reassuring civil servants at a more junior level that sort of they have got that license to do things differently. And I think, you know, equally, there is always a concern that, you know, are ministers ready for this? Are they kind of genuinely up for this? And that's one of the pushbacks that we get quite a lot from civil servants across all departments. And in fact, what Sir Jeremy and what other sort of senior civil servants would say was, you know, ministers want the best quality advice, and so, you know, it's always going to be in their interest for us to be kind of pushing this agenda forward, for us to be making sure that people are ambitious and are kind of exploring the avenues which will allow them to give ministers that advice. So, and the Minister for Policing, for example, Damien Green in the UK, has been involved in the early stages of the Home Office projects, and is kind of very keen and enthusiastic. So yes, I think there are some sort of there are barriers, there are concerns, but actually there's an enormous amount of enthusiasm, and I think in the UK kind of right change across the civil service.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And I've just been told we can go on for 5 minutes longer. So an opportunity to answer another couple of questions that are coming through. So one from Mariam Rebeldo. How do we approach potential partners that still think as designers as producers of stuff? I'll have a go at that one. And I think one of the things that is really, really important is talking in terms of common objectives. So the design principles that I shared right at the beginning of this presentation aren't necessarily specific to design. They're often about, do we just want to create a better solution? And so I think partly because design is moving into emerging areas, it's been very conscious to articulate itself, but actually we need to get smarter and better at using the language of those that we're trying to work with, which is often alien to designers. And someone once said to me, which really stuck in my mind, are designers doing ethnography with civil servants, not just, you know, the end user, to use a kind of horrible and overused phrase in this sector. So I think actually the issue of language is really, really important in terms of how designers working in this context present themselves, and actually really getting under the skin of the people that we're working with and for, and taking time to do that. I've got another question here which I want to direct towards Chelsea, and I think it's probably one of our last questions. And it's because you work with so many designers. So a question from Holly May Mahoney. On what skills do you think designers need to move into areas of government? And again, this is picking up on the idea that it's not just about graduating from a graphic design degree. So are we providing the right pathways for designers? And if not, what kind of upskilling are you doing when people come to you and start working with you? So Chelsea, over to you on that one.
You know, honestly, I feel like designers from all different kinds of design backgrounds are useful when doing this work. We've worked with industrial designers, with graphic designers, with architects, with people with a broad range of backgrounds. I think that what's really crucial is a certain kind of attitude and approach, which is one that is, first of all, profoundly humble. I mean, maybe that sounds weird, but honestly, when you are designing for the public, and particularly if you're designing for low-income and vulnerable populations, you have to really, I believe, put the needs of those populations first before your sort of perception as a designer of what's right or appropriate. And you honestly have to be humble with the public agencies with whom you are working, because they are experts on their policy environment and their constraints. So it's so important that you approach the work saying, how do we be of service? How do we bring our design skills to the table and sort of make ourselves into the hands and the makers and the problem solvers for people who have big challenges, whether those challenges are dealing with life challenges or those challenges are dealing with policy challenges.
Thank you so much. I am going to wrap up now, and there's obviously there's such a range of things that we could talk about in this context, but just to summarize through the questions and the discussion that we've been having, I think some of the really important issues that are coming out around leadership, language, the attitude of designers moving away from being the kind of ego in the design process to actually much more of a facilitator, and then two other really important areas, evidence and skills. So just in the last minute, I want to thank the NEA for giving us the platform to do this. Thank you for tuning in, and pass back to Jason just for the final word.
Thank you so much, Camilla, and you guys were so fabulous. We're going to have you back to dive in deeper into some of these issues. So I want to thank you, the amazing Design Council UK, for doing this with the National Endowment for the Arts, and of course to our two distinguished presenters. Again, this webinar will be archived for later viewing on arts.gov. And please join us for our next webinar in our Learning from Abroad series, which will be about universal design and landscape design on June 18th at 3:00 p.m. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us today, and please stay in touch with the NEA. Thanks so much. Bye.